And there we go. And we are live. It is 5:30 p.m. Pacific time and 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. And welcome for those who are tuned in. I can't see. I'm sure folks are logging in. But welcome to the State of Transgender Visibility, Politics, Policy, and Social Justice. My name is Aria Saeed. I use she, her pronouns. And I am a co-founder and the president of the Transgender District, which is the world's first legally recognized district of its kind in the world, based right here in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood. Our work, our beautiful work, was co-founded by Black trans women. Honey Mahogany and Janetta Johnson are my co-founders. And I'm so grateful for you all tuning in to a very special series that we have planned for you both tonight and next week. We've titled this series called The State of Transgender Visibility. And, you know, often with Pride, LGBT Pride, as we celebrate Pride, it always comes from the lens of sort of a cisgender experience. And so we wanted, as trans people, as trans thought leaders, to sort of create a dialogue and session on exploring and debunking and dissecting the concept of transgender visibility in a world where transgender people are more visible now in so many different areas of life than we have been 10 years ago. And today there have been significant strides of transgender people leading in progress, in particular for tonight's topic, in politics. And so we're so excited to have our trailblazing, pioneering special guest here with us tonight. But with visibility has its consequences. And so this year we have seen more than, I can't even count anymore, anti-trans legislation pieces across the United States, and more rhetoric sort of being put out that is negative and harmful to a very, very small part of the United States population. And this impact is global. And so we at the Transgender District wanted to investigate, what does it mean to be visible and visibly trans, and the landscape of transgender visibility, and for tonight's discussion in politics and social justice and public policy. And so, of course, if you like tonight's event and other events that we are bringing you this Pride season, go ahead and go to our website, transgenderdistrictsf.com, where you can learn more about our work, learn more about the upcoming events that we have, and all the different issue areas that we are addressing both here locally in our lovely neighborhood, as well as across the country. And without further ado, I would like to introduce a very, very special part of our team here at the Transgender District. She has worked tirelessly to put this session together for you all, and her name is Jupiter Peraza. Jupiter Peraza is a trans Latina advocate based here in San Francisco. She is also vocal about being an undocumented trans Latina and a DACA recipient. She is currently receiving her master's degree in international relations at San Francisco State University, and in addition serves as director of social justice initiatives here at the Transgender District. And so, Jupiter, I'd love for you to come onto the virtual stage and take it away.
Thank you so much, Aria. That was very lovely, and thank you for welcoming everyone to this wonderful event. Welcome to State of Transgender Visibility, Policy, Politics, and Social Justice. My name is Jupiter Peraza. I am Director of Social Justice Initiatives at the Transgender District. And I am so honored to introduce such an esteemed panel of trailblazers and political leaders making monumental strides for the transgender community via their own endeavors and accomplishments. It is incredibly important for us at the Transgender District to provide informative opportunities for our community to get familiar to and to know those who are leading the fight for transgender liberation in the political front. Each and every one of the panelists with us today are carrying the torch passed down by our trans elders, specifically Black and brown trans women, towards a new form of visibility. Visibility that entails unprecedented representation in politics. Now, I am happy to present tonight's panelist, Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride, San Francisco Democratic Party Chair and co-founder of the Transgender District, Honey Mahogany, Minneapolis City Councilwoman and Vice President, Andrea Jenkins, New Orleans City Council candidate and House of Tulip co-founder, Mariah Moore, Deputy Director for Trans Justice with the ACLU, Chase Strangio, and last but not least, our moderator, a creator and visionary in her own right, none other than trans/media creator, Imara Jones. Imara, take us away.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Everything in our community is like a family reunion because a great many of us know each other and know how to know each other. But so many of the people tonight, I think almost everyone tonight, I have interviewed in some shape, form, or fashion, and either on my podcast or a video series. And so this will be the first time that we've all been able to come together with me leading an interview with everyone. And so I'm excited about that. So it's in that vein of family reunion that I embrace virtually everyone who is on the panel tonight. Of course, a giant embrace for Aria and for Jupiter, and a giant embrace to all of you who are tuning in and watching. We're going to have a lively discussion tonight about many of the topics and all of the topics that Aria and Jupiter touched upon before. But at the end of this program, we will leave robust time for each of you all to be able to weigh in as well in terms of what you're hearing and seeing in your own lives, in your own communities, and what anyone has said you might wish to respond to. So those will be directed to me via the magic of everything digital through YouTube and Facebook. So please make sure that when we ask for those questions, 7 o'clock Pacific time, 10 o'clock Eastern time, that you make sure that you use those platforms to be able to communicate with us, because we want to communicate with you. It's a thrill to be able to talk to everyone tonight about this essential topic. And I think that the framing that Aria gave is a perfect one. I wanted to offer a little bit more of some thoughts around this that I will use to help guide our discussion tonight. And it's because I've really been thinking about this particular way of conceptualizing visibility, because I think that when we say visibility, many of us can mean many different things. And so I just want to bucket the visibility tonight so that we make sure that we're all on the same page term-wise, and that we all make sure that we can focus our discussion in a way that's most productive. Time is money. And for me, I think about visibility in 3 different ways. I think about it firstly in terms of the word visibility, and that is people who've chosen to be in the public eye. So that's going to include everyone on our panel. That includes people like Aria. That includes so many other people in our community, either through your art or through your activism or through your role as a leader in technology or whatever it may be. There's so many trans people who are leading in so many different areas that you've decided to be visible. You've taken a role in public life, either in your sector or through your art. I think there's another way of thinking. So that's one bucket of visibility. I also think that we also, when we talk about visibility, we can also mean being out or openly trans. We know that a lot of people across the country and communities across the country who are our siblings and nibblings cannot be openly visible because, or openly trans rather, because it is a threat to their lives and a threat to their well-being. And we want to prioritize their well-being. And so we want them to make the choices that they need to make in order to be safe. So that is whether or not people where you live in your community know that you are trans, and whether you feel comfortable sort of acknowledging that in a public way. Of course, being openly trans is a necessary ingredient to being visible in our community. So those two things are highly linked. And then I think there's a third bucket of visibility where other people decide to make us targets. You know, I think about Andrea Yearwood and Terry in Connecticut, who are the young trans girls a couple of years ago, now young women, who just wanted to run on a track team, who just wanted to be able to do what tens of thousands of other teenagers do across this country. And our political environment decided to make them a target. And suddenly those women were visible in a way that they never expected. And Chase, of course, can talk to us more about that tonight. Or I think about, Cece Telfer, very similar situation. First trans person to hold an NCAA title in track and field, and was targeted by Donald Trump, and her life will never be the same. So I think as we go through visibility tonight, and as the sun washes me out, I want us to be sure that we hold these different ideas of visibility as we move through. Because, for example, if people decide to make us targets, that's not our role in visibility. We didn't have any choice in saying that, and that's what's happening in these bills. However, there are people tonight in political office and in law and other things that have chosen to be visible. And of course, these things are linked, but they're not always. So let's be sure to keep these terms in mind as we move forward tonight. So with that framing, let's move straight into kind of the questions that we have for everyone, or that I have. We'll start with my questions, then we'll come to your questions later. And I also want to just have a word to our panelists that, I am going to be guiding the conversation, but it's everyone on here has no shortage of things to say that are smart and intelligent. And so I also want to encourage you all to feel free to build off of each other's comments and to move forward kind of in that vein. And I think my first question to each of you all tonight as we get started is, in what way did you decide to become visible? That is to say, to take who you are as a person and to bring that into the world as a part of what you do. And the second part of that question is, since doing that, have you noticed changes, either positive or negative, in the way that the world responds to you? So what's been the impact of that choice? So when that choice first come to you, and then what has been the impact of that? And I think that we can start first with the legendary, we can start with the legendary vice president of the Minneapolis City Council. Everyone held their breath when I said legendary. I could have gone in so many different directions. Honey Mahogany was like, what? But let's start out with, it applies to everyone, but let's start out first with you, Councilperson Jenkins, about when you decided to become visible and what's been the impact in your life of that visibility.
Well, let me just say that you are, in fact, legendary, Amara, and as are all of my fellow panelists. And I'm just so amazingly thrilled to be a part of this. Happy Pride, everybody, wherever you are in the United States. And wherever you are, we are on native land, stolen native land, in a country built on stolen labor. And so that's the context that we enter into all of these conversations with that kind of backdrop and that understanding of who we are and where we are. I first decided to come out publicly in my very early 30s. And that was a little over 30 years ago. So, you know, it was, I came into acceptance, my own acceptance of my identity, at a time, at a kind of a pivotal time in sort of trans history, as it were. It was right at the tail end of when the Harry Benjamin standards of care was telling people, you know, you should probably leave your community and go somewhere else and get a new name and try to find a new job, and nobody will know you, and you will be this whole new identity. But I was like, man, I got a daughter that I love madly. I got all of these friends. I went to college here in the Twin Cities, and so that's where I made all the connections and networks. And so it was the tail end of that sort of philosophy, but it was also the beginning of people should come out and talk about who they are. And so I made the choice to be out and then stay in the community that that I grew up in, that I came of age in, and initially it was challenging. I mean, you know, prior to that, I had gay identity, and that world, that the gay, that kind of, they abandoned me. I found a little more acceptance in the lesbian community, but not a lot. I mean, there was a lot of turfism going on back then. And I experienced that. But I stayed true to myself. I stayed authentic. And I think people began to honestly respect that. And, you know, I mean, I feel like when I came into acceptance of my own identity to the point where I could tell other people that I opened up some spaces within myself that allowed me to be, I think, more accomplished, more engaged in community, in developing myself, etc. And I, for the most part, Amara, it's been a pretty positive experience since I have come out. I mean, you know, authenticity matters, I think.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about your moment of deciding to become visible? I think it's a really poignant story because even though you were younger than Councilperson Jenkins, it was no less less of a feeling of stakes for you because you had seen a particular future for yourself in politics and worried about that as you made this decision. So can you just talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Amara, I think that when you said legendary, everyone else on this panel took a sigh of relief because we knew the first question was going to go to Councilwoman.
Oh, right.
And thank you so much for moderating this discussion. It's great to be on with just such incredible leaders and advocates. And I'm so grateful to the Transgender District for organizing this conversation. You know, when you asked the question originally about sort of how life has changed since becoming more visible or coming out more publicly, you sort of alluded to this. When I came out, I came out both as trans to my community, my friends and family, at the same time that I came out relatively publicly because I was serving as the student body president on my college campus at the time at American University. And, you know, I debated how I wanted to come out. I debated whether I wanted to come out sort of publicly or whether I wanted to just come out to my close group of friends and then, begin to transition. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion that I wanted to share my news and my truth more publicly for a couple reasons. One, I felt like it was going to be a topic of gossip and conversation on my campus that the student body president, or the most recent student body president, was transitioning. And I felt that it was important to get the news out on my own terms, in my own words. And it was one of the first instances where I saw, I think, the quote that it's difficult to hate someone whose story you know sort of play out in real time. I saw that in getting my news out in my own way, it allowed for a foundation to be laid with my classmates on my college campus to ensure that my news was met with, warm smiles rather than laughter. I also came out publicly because I did feel a sense of responsibility. I felt a responsibility because of the small platform that I had, that perhaps it was an important moment to try to educate people. I want to make a point on that, because I think it goes directly to what you opened with, which is that there are a lot of different paths to visibility. And when it comes to this sort of conscious path of being visible and being out and being an advocate, I do think that we too often universalize that to every person. I think we too often say, if you're trans, you have a responsibility to the community to be out, and to be out in every circumstance, in every instance. And I think that's an unfair burden to place on people. But me personally, I did feel a responsibility to try to use the support and the privileges that I had to ensure that I was helping to educate my community in whatever way I could, and hopefully utilize my own story to try to lay the foundation for empathy for other folks in the trans community who might follow me on that college campus, or who might follow me in that community, or who might be already in that community and facing stigma and prejudice, or wondering if they come out, whether they'd be welcomed. And so for me, in many ways, while my visibility has grown, the only existence I know is an existence of some level of visibility. And I think in many ways it's been liberating for me, because I don't ever wonder whether people know I'm trans. I don't ever wonder. And I'm just able to be out there and just be proud and just be out there. And that's a privilege in and of itself. But it is liberating in many ways to just have that, to not have to constantly explicitly come out, because the information is just already out there.
Thank you for that. Honey Mahogany, I'm wondering if you can talk about an added layer of this complexity, which is the intersection of all of the things that we've spoken about with immigration status, and the way that also factors into whether the navigation of many cultures and deciding on our visibility, on being out, and how that may have impacted or played out in your experience.
Sure. I mean, I was born here, so I'm not an immigrant myself, but I do come from a family of immigrants. My parents were political refugees from Ethiopia back in the late 70s, early 80s. And, I think that a lot of immigrants or children of immigrants kind of carry this idea that, or feel like we live in two worlds, one that we live in when we're in school and in the workplace and out with our friends, and another with our families. And those two different conversations, or two different people, can be very bifurcated and behave very differently in those two contexts. And I think that still holds true. And I think also as queer people, we kind of know what that's like too. Like, before you come out to your family, you may be very different with your friends than you are with your family. And certainly for me, what that has meant is that I think before I came out as trans, back when I, was first coming out as queer, I really ended up distancing myself from my family, because I think it was too painful. I grew up very close to my family, in a very collectivist culture where everything was done together, and decisions and everything were made together. And while that exists to some level, somewhat in the US, I think the overarching culture is very independent, and you're encouraged to make decisions for yourself and be your own independent person. And so in order, I think, to discover myself and grow separately from my family and those values that they, I think, instilled, right? Ethiopia is a very predominantly Christian country, so deep-rooted history in Orthodox Christianity and some Judaism and also Islam. There's a very strong Muslim community there as well. So with that sort of background, realizing that I felt like I had to take a step back and away from that and come out separately from my family first, and then have slowly started to bring my family into my coming out process. Actually, when I came out as queer, that was not an option for me. I was outed to my family by another family member. And it actually kind of speaks to how my coming out experiences have been throughout my life. Well, first I will also say that I was outed by them showing my family a picture of me in drag. So it was like all the things at once, and it was actually kind of, I mean, I look back at it, it was traumatizing at the time, but I look back at it now and I'm like, well, that was perfect. Like that was exactly how I should have come out. But I think that other people were either told, or I was even told by other people that I was away before I even knew it, like other queer people were telling me that I was queer before I realized I was queer. Other trans people were telling me I was trans before I realized I was trans. And so in that way, I almost, I don't know that it was a decision that I actively made. It was just that it just sort of naturally happened. And I think also, I guess as someone who was public before they came out as trans, that was also a unique experience. I was on, being on RuPaul's Drag Race definitely provided a platform for me and, made me visible in a way that I was not previously as, just a private citizen or someone who wasn't necessarily involved in politics at that time either. And then to sort of have to transition and figure out what my version of trans was, while also continuing to perform, while also continuing to get more and more involved in politics, was also, I don't know. I mean, I guess it was awkward, but it also just felt natural. I felt like it was a natural evolution of who I was as a person. And so I both do and don't think about it a lot. I think as trans people, we always think about it. And there's always like, whenever we look in the mirror, we're like, oh, like I want to present myself in a certain way, and and this is who I am, and does this reflect who I am in this moment? But at the same time, I think I've also come to grips with the fact that it's okay if I don't always look exactly the way that I want to, and it's okay if I'm somewhere in between, and if I look different, this morning, which I totally did, than I do right now. That's okay, and it's okay to be both versions of me in all of my different areas of my life, whether it be me working at City Hall or me as chair of the Democratic, Central Committee here in San Francisco, or me as a drag performer. So it's been an interesting journey for sure. But, I think for me, I've been lucky in that it has somewhat just evolved and come naturally, and I haven't had to think about it all that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and congratulations on your election to be the chair of the San Francisco Democratic Committee. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I know that Chase is very comfortable going last. So Chase, we're going to go to Mariah next, and then we'll come to you because I know you're happy to hang back a little bit. So Mariah, I'm wondering if you can just take us into your journey of how you became visible, especially in a place like New Orleans, which, it's a tight-knit community. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows everybody's grandma. And so can you just talk about your experience and how growing up in a place like New Orleans factored into that?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I think everyone thinks that they have this idea of the South and what it's like and, how terrible of a place it is because we're always behind. But for me, as a child growing up in the South, as a very, very queer child growing up in the South, I always found a way to express myself and affirm myself when I didn't even know it, right? Mm-hmm. Through all the discipline that my father used to, put me through all of the teasing and bullying that my brother and neighborhood kids used to, put me through. I always found a way to affirm myself. I never knew that until I was really setting sitting in front of my makeup mirror one day, really just thinking about my grandmother and thinking about, you know, all the little ways she used to show me that she saw me without me even realizing that she saw me, right? Like the fact that she never used male pronouns for me. It was always my baby, my sweetheart, my precious little one, things like that. You know, grandparents are special in a way, especially here in the South, because they always let us know that they see us. And that's not a lesson that I learned till later on in life when I was, you know, alone because of everything that we experienced, particularly as Black and brown trans folks. Once I started really coming into myself, as soon as I graduated high school, meaning medically transitioning, because I was already affirming myself by wearing the clothing that made me feel most comfortable early on. I really found that it was up to me to choose to find community that I could call family, because my biological family was not affirming nor were they supportive. So I found my family, I found my tribe, you know, and here in New Orleans, like you said, everyone does know everybody. And, you know, what's even more special, even though there are huge disparities here and violence is accelerating each and every day, even now, even back then, when I think about all of the ways in which Black and brown trans women showed up for me, right? I'm a former sex worker, right? And so thinking about the ways in which I had no support and I had no way, and I couldn't think about a way in which I could support myself, those women came along and showed me how to survive, right? And so I was able to build a future for myself through that. And so, you know, me choosing to step into my activism now, you know, it's just a testament of everything and the shoulders of the women that I stand on who really helped me be here today. And I think that, you know, through all of these women, right, even the women that I've lost that I've known that were very close to me, that I've lost tragically, I think that it makes them proud that I am continuing to use my voice, use my platform, use my lived experience and my truth to, you know, to continue to create change. I see that now because, you know, the response that I get from younger trans and gender nonconforming kids here in New Orleans, because it's still that little small tight knit community, is that I see the gratitude in their faces and, you know, the way that they walk the streets with ease, right? And it wasn't just because of me, right? It'll never just be because of me, and it's not just because of the women that helped me, but it's all the women and folks that came before us, right? In every community across the country, that allowed us to be who we are and use our voice for whatever we would like to use it for. And so that's what, you know, when I think about my visibility, I think about how important it is, you know, that, you know, if it wasn't for women and folks who came before me, that I wouldn't have a voice to use. And so, yeah, I have always been visible, right? Because I've never been afraid to be unapologetically me, even when it was painful and hurtful, and sometimes tragic. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the beauty of a lot of us from the South is that, you know, we turn our tragedies into triumphs, you know, because we realize that we've always had to fight a little bit harder. We've always had to be a little bit stronger, a little bit quicker, right? And so, yeah, I think about my grandmother and how, you know, before I could even verbalize who I was, she gave me the gift of love to say, I see you, right? And even though she may not have had words for it, she empowered me to keep loving myself no matter what anybody else said, no matter what anybody else did, and no matter how they treated me. And I think that's the unconditional love that all of us need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So Chase, it's kind of hard to think of a time when you weren't visible, but of course, because you're a human being that had to exist. So I'm wondering if you could take us into a time when you became visible and what that experience was like for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's just, I was sitting here being like, oh, I'm just getting to listen to the most amazing people. I forgot that I was had to participate. I was really just really appreciating this moment. So thank you all for including me in this conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think in one way, like gender variance was always a part of my life. And so there was a way in which like the moment of sort of coming out as trans was like weirdly overly determined, like, well, oh, do I have to explain some linear path that I was on and sort of identify myself within a binary to have recognition or coherence to other people? And so I think about like I came out as trans in law school, even though like I always was like a trans person, obviously. And that, you know, I think that process of just changing your name or changing your pronouns and sort of dealing with that discomfort, like just feels so hyper visible all the time. Like that process of correction and that process of reiteration. And you're like, and then it's just so, it can be so painful. It can be so traumatic. It can be so awkward. And so I think about that as just sort of like, and then also within transness, trying to be like, well, where do I fit in? And do I have to have a binary identity to be understood? And that, you know, was its own journey. I think that, you know, I had this incredible, beautiful privilege and opportunity that like my jobs were always in trans spaces once I came out. So my first job was at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, where, you know, almost all of our staff were trans. And so there was a way in which that was just such a soft, safe landing into like the at least my post law school work environment. Like we would just like bring our hormones into the office and bring our antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications, like this way of like holding our full, messy, complicated selves. And that was so beautiful. And then from SRLP, I sort of worked really closely with Lorena Borjas and did work in Queens, and again was just around all trans people all the time. And so there of course is like a visibility. And then I think, you know, for trans, you know, people on the trans masculine spectrum, there can be like an invisibility that happens too, especially for white trans masculine people that, you know, I think I was both kept safe by invisibility, but then also at times was hyper visible, and sort of reconciling that and trying to use like sort of the way in which as a lawyer and someone who never had my job threatened by my transness. I mean, it was like I was tokenized for being trans. I was hired for my transness, and that is like a different experience than 99.9% of trans people have. I think that, you know, so that was just, I had like a range of experiences. I think when I started at the ACLU and moved, 8.5 years ago, and moved into a cis-led environment and was in the media, started to be in the media, which was something I never wanted to do. Then I sort of was confronted with a different kind of visibility. And I remember the first time that I did an interview on camera was on Democracy Now! In 2013. And in the middle of my interview, which I thought was going to be about the Constitution, I was asked, you know, well, you're transitioning, which also I would like never describe myself as transitioning in that way. And was like asked, you know, well, talk about your experience from transitioning from female to male. And I was like, wait, what? Like, it was just so jarring. I think then over the last 8 years, there's been lots of choices I've made to put my story as sort of a part of my advocacy. And then lots of moments in which I genuinely would not want that. And it was, you know, sort of thrust upon me, in that, you know, are we able to be understood without, you know, like our transness gives us expertise, but we also have expertise, you know, that we want to speak from without telling our personal story of transness every second. And I think now I'm in this moment where I'm like, if I could just like run away and never be seen again, that would be really nice on some level. Just the level of relentlessness of cruelty, I think, you know, for visible trans people can be like a really exhausting, but it also obviously comes with like lots of beautiful moments of validation and affirmation. And so just like holding those, you know, binary, that the binary is just really just a mess of a spectrum that is also like enriching in its own way.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you should be going on one of Mariah's trips to the Dominican Republic, and then you can come back. So Mariah, you know, send send Chase your details next time. Let them know where you're going to be. But I really appreciate just the range of experiences that you all have shared and the complexity of visibility, both in your journeys and in your communities, and in some ways even globally. I think that we can fall into a trap sometimes as a community of thinking that there's only one story or one way to be, and there are as many ways to be as there are of us. And I think that we need to hold on to that, and I think that you all did that. So now you guys can breathe a sigh of relief, because we're going to get out of your personal stories and get onto the terrain where you're all really comfortable, which is in politics and policy. So, well done, everybody, but we're going to get into your comfortable spaces right now. And staying there, why don't we, before we go to all of the impacts of visibility on the negative things that are happening, we all know that those are things that are going on. But why don't we start in some ways with the things that are positive and the positive links between visibility. And Chase, so that you don't get too comfortable and think you're just watching again, we're going to stay with you and then move out from there. And in what ways do you think growing trans visibility has helped our community? And there are lots of different places that you can pick along the way where that started. You could say, it was at Stonewall, or you could say it was the trans breaking point on time. So wherever you want to pick, and just bring us into, from that point on, what has been the positive impact in terms of our civil liberties, our political rights, our participation within this country as citizens, how that's had a positive impact on that.
Yeah, no, it's really, I love you're coming to me for positive, and that is not where I'm most comfortable, but I'm going to try. I am going to be an optimist. But I mean, I would say, and I don't want to privilege the legal system at all. And I don't think legal, court-based change is really what we should be looking for liberation. But since I am a lawyer working in the courts and have that reform orientation, I think I'll speak to that. And, I just think back to litigating Amy Stevens' case at the Supreme Court. And when the court took the case, and this was the case involving, 3 individuals who were fired for being, in Amy's case, trans, and the other 2 individuals were cis gay men. And the question was, does the federal Title VII statute, which prohibits sex discrimination in employment, prohibit discrimination because someone is LGBTQ? And, when the court took the case in April of 2019, I was like, well, we're definitely going to lose. This is catastrophic. It was going to constrain what future administrations can do in terms of protecting people's access to shelter and healthcare, and the stakes felt so high. And it really did feel like there was no way that we could win this case in the conservative court that was going to decide it. The court has since gotten much worse. So, just want to hold that, just add some negativity for a moment. But I think that there's no way that we would have won that case, and we did win almost a year ago, without there being sort of a fundamental increase in people's insistence upon telling their stories, like Mariah was saying, just being I am unapologetically me, and that is going to be there. And if we didn't have so many people mobilizing and organizing in all of the ways that so many trans people have been doing for generations, we wouldn't have won that case. There's just no way. It's not like we made amazing arguments and that's why we won. I think we did make amazing arguments. We wrote good briefs, but that's not how you win cases, especially incredibly high profile cases at the Supreme Court. So I will say that without the visibility, without the organizing, without the demand by all of the people here and so many others, we never would have won that case. And I think that as much as that wasn't liberation, and that's just a small moment on the path towards a much bigger change that we need, that was important in sort of changing the material conditions for our community, and I think visibility had an important role in that.
Yeah, and hopefully that case sets the precedent for the expansion of rights legally across the board. We'll see if that happens. Andre, I'm wondering, since you've been in elective office, I believe longer than anyone on this panel, I'm wondering if you can talk about this question, how you believe that the growing visibility of trans people has led to an expansion of our political voice, and whether or not you see that, excuse me, personally, where you live and in your community. And of course, you also have national political roles on various committees within the Democratic Party. So what are you seeing from where you sit?
Well, you know, you mentioned I have the longest term in office, which is I've only been in office 3.5 years, but you know, so I mean, but that says a lot about, you know, what's going on in our community in terms of achieving political power. But as I was sitting here looking and thinking, I've also, and just kind of relative to your first question, Amara, you know, it was important for me. I came up and through the AIDS epidemic when it was full blown, like all of my friends, and it was just really important to be a Black trans voice in that conversation because Black trans women were just being left completely behind. I mean, it was all about men who have sex with men. You know, very little thought about African Americans, and then subsequently, like no thought about trans identified people. So that felt really important to be a voice during that time and to be engaged and to be an advocate. But you know, the importance, I think, of being at the table in terms of a political voice. I mean, it because of the elections of, you know, myself, my colleague, Philippe Cunningham, Danica, Sarah, Titus, and just so many others. You know, we've had the first trans woman, you know, confirmed by the Senate to be, you know, the undersecretary of health. I mean, like, we are a part of the dialogue, and that all comes from visibility. I mean, this current president said in 2014, you know, in that article where Laverne Cox was on the cover of the Tipping Point article, which was a shift in my mind in visibility when Laverne was on the cover. And having been out and been and visible for a long time prior to that, like nobody really was thinking, you know, like I hadn't not made the kind of impact that she did on that. And quite frankly, nobody has until Caitlin, who subsequently was on the cover of Vanity Fair a little bit later. But I think that that kind of visibility has created awareness in the political realm. I mean, right now there is no sort of qualms about having trans inclusion in the Equality Act. I mean, that's a shift. I mean, that had been really a hotly contested debate for decades. And so, you know, there is some positivity to that kind of visibility. You know, I have to agree with Chase in that legal and policy, you know, those things aren't going to be the sole factors in changing our community. I watched the 6-part Pride series a couple of weeks ago, and was just amazed personally that, like, I literally knew almost everybody in every single episode, but just to be able to have lived through this moment in history, and how even in recounting LGBT history, how critical and important a voice Black trans women have had on this movement. You know, thinking about Cheyenne, thinking about Raquel, you know, thinking about, you know, Miss Major and Monica Roberts, rest in peace, and, you know, just how Black trans women have really left a major impact on this movement, and all throughout the history of this country, I would say, but that's a longer conversation. So, but I don't know. I think that gets at your question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That is an amazing series. Everyone should try to watch it. And I know Raquel is leading another one of these conversations here at Transgender District next week, so make sure you tune in for that. Mariah, I wanted to come to you next because you were already a visible person. Now you've decided to run for a political office in New Orleans. And,
yes, Queen.
And there are so many, there can be a tension in our community about whether or not and how people should be involved in political life. And I'm wondering why you decided, as an activist in your community, why you decided to run for political office and how your visibility played into your decision.
That's a very, very good question. And there were a couple of different reasons why. One of the first reasons why is because I am everything that people deem incapable of occupying. Like, I can't occupy these spaces because I'm a former sex worker. I can't occupy these spaces because I'm not a college graduate. I can't occupy these spaces because I am not the cookie cutter image of what someone who is seeking a decision-making seat should be. But the other reason why is because I remember when I was trying to obtain my degree, I was sitting in my political science class, and my professor started talking about inalienable rights and how, as an American citizen, we have these inalienable rights that no one can take from us. And I remember sitting there saying, this doesn't apply to me. Because the things that everyone else, the rights that everyone else has that can't be taken away, ours are threatened every single day. It's threatened every single day. And people argue over whether or not we should, you know, access to the things that keep us safe and alive, right? Like healthcare, like education, like housing, right? All of these things, all of these things that should be readily available to us, right, are always threatened. And I remember asking him, I said, so what would you say to me, a trans woman sitting in your class, saying, you're teaching this to me, but I still don't believe that all of this applies to me. And I remember him telling me this. He said, well, I think that's your job to do something about it. And so I decided every morning to get up and try to do something about it because, you know what, I want other trans and gender nonconforming community members, youth, to realize that you don't have to live up to the standards and the expectations of society. You can be and do whatever it is that you want to. And so, you know what, when I went and I looked at the requirements to be a city council member, I didn't see masters in poli-sci. I didn't see verbiage that said you couldn't be a former sex worker. I didn't see any of that. What I saw was pay your taxes, don't have traffic tickets, and be a resident of your district for at least 2 years. And so I think that this is a path that I need to create to let our other community members know that you can do it, right? And you don't have to be this person that people deem holier than thou, right? You can have a past, right? But still be above reproach. Because Mariah Moore is above reproach, because I have given everything back to my community, because I'm still here. And I owe it to my community, right? To continue to fight and to continue to use my past experiences to create a future where younger folks don't have to experience what I experienced, what my elders like Miss Opal, D'Ebony Cherry, China Gibson, all of these women experienced. That is my responsibility, right? And with all the and I talked about this earlier, the losses that I've experienced, it made me want to fight just that harder, because I don't want to continue losing my brothers, my sisters, and my siblings. I think about the women and the folks that I grew up with, and over half of them are no longer here, whether it be through violence or health disparity, right, or stigma. They're no longer here with me. And
Wow.
I don't know about any of you all, but I don't want to grow older alone. I want to grow into my golden age with my community, right? And the only way that I'm going to do that is to continue to fight for my community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Sarah, I'm wondering, you are not only a historic making politician right now in your own right, the first person to be elected to a state senator who's openly trans in the United States, but as a part of that, your state, Delaware, you happen to be close to the Biden family and have known them for quite a while. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role in any way that you know about the impact of the visibility of trans people, perhaps even yourself, but it could be in wider society, has had on the thinking of the president in terms of wanting to make the overturning of a lot of the Trump administration's anti-trans policies a priority, the inclusion of trans people into the Equality Act. That is to say, is there any way that you can talk about the impact of trans visibility on kind of the president's thinking?
Sure, absolutely. And before I get to President Biden, one thing that's sort of been on my mind during this conversation as we hear it is just sort of how much we live in a world of contradictions, right? And that it's always in these moments of significant challenge that we also see significant progress, that the challenge of being sort of progressive minded is to never lose sight of how far you've come, to never be pacified by your progress, but to never forget the progress that you've already made. And another thing that's coming to my mind that a couple of the answers in the first question just brought up for me is this sort of feeling, I think, for those of us who are sort of consciously visible because of professional opportunities, is this sort of, for lack of a better term, almost survivor's guilt, where you feel this sense of, on the one hand, you're like, why does everything always have to be all about my personal story and my trans identity? Why do I face these extra sort of responsibilities, these extra burdens even? And yet at the same time, the very fact that you're facing those challenges is because your presence is notable, which only highlights how lucky you are to have these opportunities, how unique it is to have these opportunities. And so just one of the themes that seems to be top of mind for me as I'm listening to these answers is this theme of our lives and our movement and our history being one of just such significant contradiction. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the president, Delaware is a small state. I call us a state of neighbors, but probably more accurate is the saying that everyone in Delaware is dated, mated, or related. And so we're a small community, and in a small community like this, growing up, it wasn't rare to see Joe Biden at the grocery store. It's still not rare to see Joe Biden at the grocery store, to see Joe Biden and Jill Biden, out to dinner at a local pizza shop, out for church on Sunday. It's really, it's a common occurrence, both when he was a senator and now vice president, later president. And I first got to know the Bidens just as a neighbor in Delaware, but I got to know them on a deeper level through their son, Bo, who I worked for when he was running for state attorney general and then running for reelection as the state attorney general. And I knew Bo before I came out. I became close with him before I came out. And then when I came out, he was incredible. We talked about earlier about the sort of constant need to correct. I never ever had to correct Bo. I think about how much he put on the line when we were pushing a non-discrimination bill here, a gender identity non-discrimination bill here in Delaware in 2013, and he put the full weight of not just his office but his personal political credibility on the line for that. I do think that was partly informed by his relationship with the trans community, with trans people, with me. Like I said, it's difficult to hate up close. It's difficult to hate someone whose story you know. And similarly, when proximity exists, it's easy to then feel both passion and to prioritize an issue because it's no longer abstract. Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't require personal relationships, but just speaking practically, that oftentimes is a not necessary ingredient, but a common ingredient in changing a conversation and changing a dynamic and changing people's beliefs, or at least certainly solidifying their beliefs in support. And so Bo really was a huge champion. And I think in many ways, the president's long-standing sort of rhetorical championing of trans rights, as was mentioned back in 2013, I think was when he first really started speaking out about this. But then after Bo passed away in 2015 is when Joe Biden started talking more about it. And I think in many ways it was a byproduct of not just his relationship with trans folks, but also feeling like trans rights was part of his son's life's work, his son's legacy. And I think in many ways he feels closer to Bo when he's advocating for things that Bo cared about, which included trans rights. And so obviously now he's president of the United States, and from the rhetoric comes action, and we've seen some important steps. And as the administration continues to staff out and get more people on board at places like the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, it's my hope that we will see that much more coming from the administration, particularly when it comes to fighting back and beating back against these anti-trans bills at the state level. But I'm optimistic that we'll see that, because I really do think that the president feels a deep connection here, and it's not just because of his relationship with trans folks, it's because of his son.
Wow. Honey Mahogany, what have you seen the impact of growing visibility of trans people and specifically trans women of color in San Francisco with regards to the way that politicians are responding to us? And how, that's one question, so you can take either one or relate them. Or secondly, how you decided to take the fact that you were well known in your community and to turn that into political power for Black and brown trans people.
Well, I mean, I do want to acknowledge that I think that San Francisco is maybe a unique landscape in a lot of ways than other parts of the country, right? Certainly there are lots of progressive cities across the country, but I mean, in San Francisco, there really just aren't Republicans in office. And so in some ways we really haven't had to push back again. Like, we're not passing anti-trans laws in San Francisco. They're not being considered right now. And in many ways, anything that has to do with the LGBT community or the trans community specifically has broad support. I think that people, even if they are perhaps on a moderate scale in San Francisco, would probably be considered a flaming progressive communist anywhere else in the country. or even actually outside of San Francisco and the rest of the state. So in that sense, everyone has been very supportive of the trans community for as long as I've been actively involved in politics. I will say that I've definitely worked with politicians who are not personally perhaps comfortable with trans people, who perhaps personally don't quite know how to react or feel awkward, or, but I think in some ways that, even works to my advantage or our community's advantage, because then they just want to say yes to anything so that they can get out of an awkward conversation. So I just think that, we've been lucky to have a lot of great opportunity. I mean, obviously there has been a lot of work that has been done locally in San Francisco, starting way back before Harvey Milk, wow. starting way back before even the Compton's cafeteria riots, where there has been San Francisco has been it has been a refuge for the LGBT community in many ways over the years, and continues to be. People come here all the time because they don't feel safe in their hometowns, because they're looking to find themselves, because they're wanting to transition, and they heard that there's great resources in San Francisco. And that has really led to, I think, us collectively continuing to organize, building on the work of political leaders like Milk, and really learning how to advocate for our community in a way that has, I think, produced some really terrific results. I first got involved in politics because I was fighting for my community, right? I saw the displacement of my trans brothers and sisters from a city where they felt safe to places where they no longer felt safe, where they no longer had access to healthcare, where they were housed, but basically didn't have anything else. And that was a life or death situation for many of my community members. And so I got involved in politics to say, like, no, we can't continue to do this, and we have to continue to build the resources in the city where the communities are, where they have support systems, and we have to keep people housed here and prevent them from being displaced. I think the second part of your question as to why I chose to use my visibility, well, I mean, I did Drag Race, and I really, there were many things that I enjoyed about it, and getting to travel and getting to perform, and it did give me a platform. But I was a social worker before I was on Drag Race. Engaged, I think, helping others was a value that I sort of was raised with, and being a person for others was a value that I was raised with. And so when I saw things in my community that I didn't like, or I couldn't abide and didn't want to stand for, I took it upon myself to make those changes. And then, having been on Drag Race, I all of a sudden had a platform where I could sort of launch off of in order to bring attention to certain issues. So I was already doing that work. Like I said, I had my MSW before going on Drag Race. So post Drag Race, when I started getting involved with that again, it was just natural that I would use the platform and the skills and the name that I had to bring attention to the inequities that I saw my community experiencing, and use it to sort of create change.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So let's turn now to the darker side of visibility, and the idea that visibility may have impacted people deciding to sponsor these trans bills. There are over 127 this year in 36 states. As of right now, it changes almost every single day. And I want to make this actually a bit of jump ball and see what the thoughts that you all may have had, because there has been some controversy around this. I mean, my own personal point of view is that I don't think that our visibility had much to do with these bills. I think that when you ask, so I've spoken to politicians who've introduced these bills, and they normally only can point to they can point to two cases in the country. They don't point to people in their neighborhoods. They don't point to people in their states. They don't point to people in their districts. And so I think that when you ask them, the people behind these bills, where they're coming from, it has very little to do with visibility, of people that they know, or something that happened in their states. But there is kind of an urban, I think, a growing sense that there may be some link between the anti-trans bills and growing visibility. And so I'm wondering, as political leaders, as people who are leading some of these fights across the country, what you all think. And then we have two people on the panel who live in states where there have been anti-trans bills that have been introduced. Luckily, they haven't gone anywhere in Minnesota and Louisiana. So this is kind of a jump ball question. What's your own take? What do you think? What do you have to say about this?
So there has been legislation in Minnesota, but we have a Democratic governor and Democratic control of the House. So they won't go anywhere. The governor will veto anything or not sign anything. But I tend to think that it is backlash. I think it is a really hot button issue that, it's like a scapegoat to rile up the right to get fundraising. It's a red herring, really. I mean, before Dean made his video, 20 years ago, trans people were using the bathroom. Like, trans people use the bathroom. That's going to happen. So, nobody really, knew about it until, it just became something to heat people up. That's my opinion. I mean, I think it's, everything is being attacked by the right. Black people, voting rights, women, and I think trans identified people are just as much a part of that as well. I mean, and quite frankly, there are as many just broadly gay legislation as there is trans legislation too. Interested to hear what Chase thinks.
Chase probably wants to know what everyone else thinks, but you've been put on the spot, Chase.
I mean, yeah. So I don't think that what we're seeing with attacks on trans people now is the continuation of. I mean, you could go back to colonialism and the ways in which the gender binary has been part of the imperial project and has been enforced as a state building. Project. And I think that, it's always there. I think what we're seeing now is, related to a lot of things. If anything, I think it's in response to, if it's in response to visibility at all, it's visibility of cis gay people getting married and the LGBTQ mainstream movement not investing enough in trans people, because the inevitable backlash of the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell was that trans people were going to be harmed and targeted in response to that. And we didn't do the infrastructural investment in trans work that was needed to prevent the backlash that we saw initially in 2016 with the bathroom bills, and then now with the bills attacking access to healthcare. But this is a global movement. It's incredibly well funded. It is, it has existed for centuries, and it certainly existed in the United States for decades. You can look at the moralistic panic of Anita Bryant and Phyllis Schlafly, and that is the discourse that we're seeing now. But again, I think it's really about money. It's about control. It's about it's about also white supremacy and everything. These bills are existing, as Andrea said, alongside the voter suppression bills, alongside the anti-protest bills. The theme of 2021 across the country is suppress protests, take away the right to vote, and enforce the sex binary in deeply violent ways that expand the power of the state and surveillance of people's bodies. And I think that should concern us all, and they're all related.
Which is all about the abortion stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that is 100% hand in hand with these attacks.
Yeah, so it's yes, visibility, it's like a dynamic process, but this is about power, this is about money, this is about state control, and this is about it's trying to sort of continue to build a a country through systems of suppression and oppression that are predicated on like a white heterosexual Christian family structure that has been sort of the model for maintaining power. And so it's a continuation of that. But if we have to blame visibility, I would blame cis gay visibility and our lack of investment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think before we go on, I just wanted to say that at Translash, we've actually been investigating for the past year the people, the money, the organizations that are behind the anti-trans backlash. And on June the 24th, we are coming out with a special limited series podcast called The Anti-Trans Hate Machine. The trailer for that launches tomorrow, actually across social media, so you'll be able to hear about it. But so many of the things that have been touched upon are, and I think that this is something that the right has been planning for years. This particular moment around trans rights, and we talked to dozens of people across the country, including many of the people who wish to do us harm. And looking at the roots of this movement that go back to the 1980s. So I want to encourage each of you to subscribe to the Anti-Trans Hate Machine that comes out the first episode on June 24th. Were you going to say something, Andrea?
Yeah, no, I'm unmuted. I was just, I do want us to really think about it in terms of anti-trans, but I also want us to think more broadly. It's got to be a coalition. To really fight back, I believe. And it's got to be a coalition of, trans, BLM movement, ability rights movement, reproductive rights movement, even the, affordable housing movement and the drive for 15, like all of these issues are intersected and interrelated. And I just don't want us to get bogged down in only thinking that this attack on trans community is the only issue. And I think we get more traction as coalitions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, though, that, when you look at a lot of the groups that are behind this, they are behind a lot of these other issues, but there is a particular way that they are using trans issues to advance its agenda. And I don't think we can lose sight of that. But Sarah or Mariah, yeah, anybody?
No, I was just going to say, I agree totally that this is it seems retaliatory, but I just want to give a huge thank you to all the organizers here in Louisiana, Dylan Wagasback, Sarah Jane Guidry, all of the grassroots Black and brown organizers who showed up every single day to the Capitol, right? And, fought for us, fought for our youth in Texas. My friend Emmett, who is the executive director of Tent, who drove many, many days back and forth to Austin, right in the middle of the night, because, they were playing the dirty ledge game, switching up, the time, and the real commitment, right, and the love that organizers and activists have for our communities, right? And who are the true champions of pride, right? And who really keep us safe, right? So I just want to tell them thank you. I was not able to be at the Capitol, but I knew that, our future was in good hands because of the activists and organizers that were there. So, yeah.
And if I could just build on if it's all right, two of the points or some of the points that were made by Chase and Andrea, because I think there's just two extra points. I think they hit it out of the park in terms of describing what's at play. And I think to Chase's point around this is a continuation of an ongoing fight. And I think Chase is absolutely right. You can trace that back hundreds of years. But I think one of the things that we have seen is that these forces, they find their stranglehold on power and they use that. right? So during the Obama administration, we had a friendly administration in the White House, and you saw a proliferation of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ bills at the state level. Then the Trump administration came into office, and they didn't need to push at the state level because they had a federal government that was advancing these anti-trans policies. And then, of course, Trump loses re-election, and you get an administration that's pro-trans equality, and they have to go back to the states. And so I think sometimes we can see this uptick in state laws as a sign of some new backlash or some new force. But the reality is, it's the folks who are pushing these bills now were staffing the Trump administration for 4 years, and before that, we're pushing forward these bills at the state level. And so there is really absolutely a through line throughout history, and then of course a through line over the last 10 years. And it's just where they have found their hold on power that they use it. And then to a point that Andrea made around solidarity and coalition, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that opponents see that. And I think part of the strategy around the specific bills that we're seeing right now is an attempt to replicate some of the strategies that we've seen overseas in tapping into the TERF movement. It has been very successful in countries like the United Kingdom, where they have essentially split the left, and where the trans movement does not have friends on the right, and has not only fewer friends on the left than they might in the States, but some of their most vocal opponents are seemingly on the left. And so I think they're trying to replicate that strategy here. I think they fortunately thus far have not been successful in driving a wedge within the progressive movement. I think part of it goes to what Andrea was talking about around choice, where they can't drive a wedge because we see very clearly that the same people that are fighting to take away trans rights are the same people, and undermine trans rights are the same people seeking to undermine reproductive justice. They're the same folks seeking to get in the way of economic justice. They're the same folks who are trying to push back against any meaningful police reform. And so we see that connection very clearly, but they're certainly trying to replicate that strategy because they understand that in the solidarity that we have within the progressive movement, that's a power. And if they can break us up, then if they can divide us, then they'll have a greater chance at success.
Mm-hmm. Honey Mahogany, any thoughts on this?
I mean, I don't want to repeat what everyone has already said. I feel like I agree. I will say that I agree with you, Amara, that I think that this would be happening even without the visibility. You know, some of the visibility, I think definitely, it makes it easier for them to sort of point and you know, actually make they have they have us in the room, so they can point to us and say, like, look what's happening. But I think that it would have happened anyway. And I think actually because of the positions that many of us hold, because of the work that we have done, we are actually in a better position. So I'm thankful that we're here at the table, and that we, you know, have the tools that we need to be able to fight back. You know, if we weren't, and if we were relegated to sort of the corners and the dark rooms, and, you know, relied only on our allies to do all the work, I just don't think that, you know, we'd be as successful at fighting some of this back. So I'm really proud of all of us and all the work that we've done.
We're the best people to fight for ourselves. It's funny that people talk about visibility and the way that it relates to a backlash. And I often say, you know, we still don't know who killed Marsha P. Johnson. You know, like, you know, that like trans people have been targets of violence and extreme violence for a long time before there was visibility. And as so many of you have said, it's not anything new. We're about to move into audience questions in about 5 or 6 minutes. So we want to get the audience ready to ask any questions that you might wish. This is your time to kind of take over the moderation. So make sure that you get your questions together, and we'll begin to take those in a couple of minutes. But before we get to that, kind of one of my last questions before we begin to get those from the audience is one that's controversial. And that is, I'm wondering what you, this is, you know, one of the, something that was on the mind of the transgender district, which is, you know, the underscoring that trans people aren't a monolith, and that we come in all different shapes and sizes and backgrounds and places in the country. And a part of that is, people like Caitlyn Jenner who are visible and have been very visible. And in some respects, people mentioned the Vanity Fair piece as a part of that time of Laverne and all of the rest of it in terms of growing popularity and people believing that maybe that helped to advance conversations. But then, of course, their candidacy right now, in many ways, even as they are quite clearly a trans woman, can be seen as anti-trans in certain ways from the positions that they've taken aside from their identity. So I'm wondering if you all can just talk about any thoughts that you may have about how in their person, in Caitlyn's person, how she personifies this double-edged sword around visibility and the dangers that may come with it in terms of people who have platforms and then can decide to use those platforms either to help or harm us.
I was gonna go ahead, Sarah.
It's funny because this is the second time today I've been asked about Caitlyn Jenner, and when I got asked it before, I was in a conversation with other trans folks, and I was like, it's funny, I haven't gotten asked this question yet, but I shouldn't be surprised that it's coming up. I'll start by saying I think one of the things I used to say when Caitlyn first came out and people would say, oh, is Caitlyn Jenner a positive for the community? I'd say, well, one, I think it's always a positive when someone is able to live authentically. And two, there were certainly conversations that happened around dinner tables and in living rooms that wouldn't have happened had it not been for not just her interview, but with Diane Sawyer, but then ABC that night did segments, local ABC did segments on local trans folks in every community around the country. Now we get to her candidacy, which, I don't know what to make of her candidacy from a sort of seriousness perspective, not only because, California is a blue state and her polling seems to be pretty darn low, but also because she seems to be doing the cable news circuit, but doesn't actually seem to be talking to voters. Right. So, I do think that this largely seems like a vanity campaign, which makes her comments around trans students and the anti-trans bills we're seeing even that much more tragic, that there would be no excuse typically, and they're even that much more offensive that she's doing this purely to get on Fox News. She is a reflection, her candidacy is a reflection of an all too common thread in marginalized communities of the most privileged people seeking to obtain greater privilege and greater acceptance by defining themselves as closer to privilege at the expense of everyone else in the community. I'm normal, I'm just like you, I'm not like these other people. And she's doing that and trying to separate herself from the rest of the community, both in what she sort of presents a trans person is supposed to be, but then of course in her political beliefs. I'm not this crazy radical trans person is a way for her to try to obtain privilege and acceptance in circles that, Caitlyn, they're never going to accept this.
Well, let's think about it in the positive, man. We made it possible for Caitlyn to be able to espouse her idiotic ideas, without, threat of violence or retribution. Her candidacy, and I mean that. I mean, had not Sarah been elected state senator and Danica House of Delegates and myself, like Caitlyn wouldn't be running. We have shifted the world to where a rich ass white supremacist reality TV star Republican trans person can step forward and run for office. I don't think she will get elected in the state of California as governor. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So it clearly is a vanity, if that's what you want to call it, campaign. Revenge campaign. I like to think of all of these people running against Gavin. I mean, like, they're running out of hatred, right? And that is not a way to seek election to public office. You got to stand for something, and not be against things. So at any rate, I think, and I mentioned Caitlin and that article, that Vanity Fair article, and arguably she was the most famous person ever to come out as trans. So I mean, so people were having this conversation all over the world. What is trans identity? As you noted, Sarah, there was all of this education that happened around it. But the run for governor is it's kind of ridiculous, and it's deeply offensive the way she is dragging our community.
I actually, I don't really watch the Kardashians. I haven't watched it, but they're on their final season, and so I was like, well, sure, let's see what's going on. And I tuned in for like the first 2, maybe 3 episodes, and I found it quite remarkable that on one of the first episodes, there's actually an episode where Caitlyn's assistant calls Kris Jenner and is basically like, Caitlyn is kind of in a rut and is trying to figure out what her next step is and what she should be doing. So would you mind giving her a call and giving her some advice on how she could push her career forward? And it was literally right before Caitlyn launched her campaign for governor. So I don't know how anyone is taking this seriously, especially because they aired the episode and aired that content. I mean, Kris Jenner was like, you should go on YouTube and you should do these things and da-da-da-da-da. She never said you should run for governor. But given the context and the timing of that, I just find it, hard to believe that number one, that she hasn't been called out more publicly around this, but number two, that anyone would take her seriously. And, I agree with, what Andrea said, like, I think, and everyone and other people have also said that, she did provide visibility in a really powerful way for the trans community, and her TV show, aside from who she was, in highlighting so many other members of our community, also had really interesting conversations take place, including around race. And around her being a Republican. I will say that this also plays into, I think, something else that we oftentimes talk about as trans people when we talk about visibility, in what type of visibility are we actually getting? And, that whole trope of, what it means to be trans and it being tied exclusively to sex work, exclusively to being killed, exclusively to, suffering. And Caitlyn also kind of showing another stereotype, was just, being a trans woman is only about makeup and hair and being famous. And that is what it means to be a trans woman. And you have no other values, and, everything else is negotiable. And connected to this also is this isn't really a new strategy for the Republican Party to use celebrity to get elected. I mean, we saw that with Ronald Reagan. We saw that with Arnold Schwarzenegger. We have seen that with Donald Trump, and now we're seeing that with Caitlyn Jenner. So this is just it's a trend. I'm glad that she doesn't appear to really be taking this very seriously. Like Sarah said, she's not really campaigning very hard. No one on the left here takes her seriously, from what I have seen or heard. And so this is just a glorified publicity stunt. But I don't know, I'm tired. And I'm tired of having to fight people like her. And I'm, really tired of the Republican Party. So I don't know, there it is. I think it's unfortunate that anyone is giving her any more of a platform. And I think that they should all just watch the Kardashians first couple episodes of the season.
Excellent point, honey. And the only thing I worry about is, we kind of thought the same thing about the orange dude, and he became president. So we got to be careful. We got to be careful.
I have a very different opinion about this. I don't agree that Caitlyn did anything for especially poor Black and brown sex working folks in the South. I won't give her those accolades of visibility and bringing awareness to trans issues. I will give it to Laverne, who was my cover girl, who was on the cover of Time magazine, and me actually probably, I remember it correctly, I almost lost my breath because I saw us on Time magazine. So I won't give Caitlyn Jenner that. I don't remember seeing an interview about trans folks on my local media outlet down here, but I did remember seeing folks heckling us and talking and saying really, really gross and disturbing things about us. And I don't think it was because of the fact that she was trans. I just think that it was more so some of the things that she had already begun to say, some of the opinions that she already had. And so when I think about that, I think about the fact that, she'll never be one of us in terms of knowing what it's like to live and walk in our truth every single day and experience not having, safety and security. We're talking about someone who sits here and lives in a bubble, who has security, who has chefs and a jet, who doesn't have to fly commercial, right? Someone who is constantly surrounded by security and comfort. We are talking about a person who is, without question, a white supremacist. We are talking about somebody who constantly practices misogyny, right? Who is constantly transphobic because they don't know what it is to have community, to be in community. She doesn't know what it's like to have true sisterhood and friendship and bonds. She doesn't know what it's like to struggle. And when you're falling down, to have your community pick you up. She doesn't know that because she's always lived a life of privilege. And so she values nothing. She doesn't value true lived experience and struggle. So I will never see her. I'll respect her. And I will correct other people who disrespect her. But I will never hold her in such a regard that I give her credit for anything.
Well, it's hard to say anything more than that. Maybe I think that was a really powerful reminder, Mariah. I wanted to move on to audience questions, unless you were dying to say something on this, Chase, or do you feel all right? Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mariah. Okay, so we're getting some really great questions. One of them, and these can be jump ball, and because we're getting several of these, I would just say that you don't have to feel a need to answer every question. I think just answer the questions that you that respond most to you, because we're getting a couple in here. So the first one is, for people who are testifying at public hearings against the state bills, what's your advice? What are the tips that you would give someone who is testifying at public hearings?
I would say prepare your remarks. You'll be a little more comfortable. And generally, when you're testifying like that, it's pretty timed. I mean, you only get a certain amount of time. So to have prepared statements, I think is a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I'll just jump in quickly and say a lot of times when folks are organizing public comment, that there are scripts that are passed around, and so I would say definitely it's important to take the time to make it your own. So think about how, and I also think that the most moving public comment is based on personal stories and experiences. So definitely be willing and look at ways in which you can share a personal bit of information in your public comments, and definitely time yourself and practice it, as Councilwoman Jenkins said.
Absolutely.
I'm not I don't have the expertise that others have on this, but I would say one thing I was really struck by this session, and I testified in a number of states and at once in a single day because of the nature of Zoom testimony in this moment. But, I deal with these types of bills in court and in legislatures all the time, and I was so struck by how painful emotionally it was to listen, and just have to bear witness to that level of cruelty coming from the government, even though it's so, you expect it, but when you're waiting to testify and you're nervous, and you're saying potentially something really vulnerable, I think creating an emotional plan is really important, because it can be really painful and upsetting and demoralizing and sort of dysregulating to have to sit through it, and then put yourself out there and then have to contend with just existing in the world after hearing that or listening to whatever ends up coming up. So I would just say have an emotional safety plan as well.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Anyone else on this?
Make them uncomfortable.
Make them
uncomfortable with your truth. Child, don't sit there and try to clean it up. Say exactly what it is. Speak from your heart, honey. I go into rooms all the time and I make people uncomfortable because I tell them the truth. It's you have to tell the truth. Like, don't try to create this cookie cutter story or version of what your truth is and what your experience is. Child, the truth makes people uncomfortable. So make them uncomfortable.
Make them uncomfortable with your truth. What are your opinions? Next question is, what are your opinions on voting for the most progressive candidate in primaries versus voting strategically for slightly less progressive candidates who might have an easier time of winning? And I think this is particularly relevant right now when we have this discussion about the role of people like Joe Manchin and the balance of, do you go for people who can be most progressive or do you go for people who can win? And what's the balance in going about making that decision?
Ranked choice voting. That's what we need. And then,
can you explain that for people who don't know what that is?
Ranked choice voting is a voting system that is in effect here in Minneapolis, in other cities in the state, but not throughout the whole state. But essentially, it allows you to vote for up to 3 candidates for an office, and you rank them 1, 2, or 3, and then you can vote for the most progressive candidate, and if they don't prevail, then your vote gets transferred to your second choice, etc. And so, it's a way of really relieving, I think, that that stress of that deep question: do I vote for Bernie Sanders because I believe in his values, or do I vote for Joe Biden because I think an old white dude is the only person that's gonna win? And you don't have to deal with that. That's not available in every state. So, I think you got to vote with your heart, but you also have to be strategic. Not an easy answer, but that's what we got to do.
What are some of the answers for people who don't have ranked choice voting? What do other people think about this question? It's a big debate in our community all the time.
So first, I'd say to Andrea's point that if you don't have ranked choice voting, we can advocate for voting systems changes and advocate for policies like ranked choice voting, because I think she's absolutely right about changes in our voting system allowing people to not have to feel like they're choosing sort of the lesser of two evils. Obviously there are probably certain examples where you have candidates who would face an objectively difficult time in a particular race in a particular district. But ultimately, I think more often than not, we really don't know. I think we project an understanding of who is electable, what they look like, what they believe. And I don't know that we actually see that bearing out in actual election results when the seemingly unelectable candidate ends up winning a primary. And so I think ultimately, because, if you had all the information, if you were able to predict sort of who does have the most, the best chance, it'd be one thing to make a sort of practical strategic vote. But ultimately, I think we have to challenge what we actually think is electable. If one, because it's the right thing to do, but two, because ultimately we're seeing example after example of the seemingly unelectable candidates winning and then serving. And so I think ultimately, people should vote with their heart and people should vote with their values. And we should redefine what is electable by doing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Now, I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative here and move us on because we're getting in many questions. And so I know that some of you all have a hard stop. We collectively have a hard stop in 14 minutes. So I'm also going to ask, I know this is hard for some people who are politically inclined and also definitely lawyers, but I'm going to ask you to keep your questions extremely short. We've been very generous giving you lots of runway to this point. Now let's just try to keep our questions short so that we can move through everyone's questions in the amount of time that we have, respecting your time by ending on time. So the next question that we have is, how can trans and gender nonconforming communities, especially young people, approach getting involved in political or legal spheres while balancing trans identities, given the fact that a lot of these systems don't support or include us?
My approach has been to step in those spaces. I think, like Mariah talked about, where, people don't see you every time. It's, it's a new push to, hey, let me go over here and invade the University of Minnesota and see, how I fare in that environment. Let me go over here to City Hall and see how I fare in that environment. Let me run for office, just continuously pushing. So, to get involved in politics is volunteer for a candidate that you really, support. And then subsequently, from the involvement in their campaign, then there becomes opportunities to work in their offices, etc. That's a way to get engaged in politics. And maybe Chase can talk about legal questions, but showing up is how you get involved.
Yeah, I would.
Go ahead. Whoever wants to go next.
Oh, sorry. I was going to just say, I think that there's many different paths. I don't think that there's one path in particular into getting into politics, but I also want to clarify that I don't think getting into politics means necessarily running for office, right? I mean, I think that is not something that everyone necessarily will want to do. And I highly suggest that folks maybe get started by attending a local Democratic club that matches your interests, that represents who you are. And if there isn't one, then create one. Start having some of those conversations, figure out what's on the ballot, figure out who the candidates are, have meetings about who you think your club should support and organize around. As Andrea said, go go and work on a campaign and then sort of figure out like where you fit. Because I will say that, there are many times in which I'm like, well, maybe I should just go back to being an activist, because, it is just, there's some parts of it that are so much more straightforward and just like, you can focus and do this one, thing or on this one issue. And that is for a lot of people what they really want to do and what they love to do. And I think that, being an elected official, in many ways, you're pulled in many different directions. And part of your job is to convene and to help people come to some sort of agreement or in between and compromise. And so that's not for everyone. And so just putting that out there, there's many different ways to be involved and make a difference. And definitely also encouraging those who feel like that's something that they can do to please do run for office.
Yeah, I agree
Excellent.
with you, honey. I think that, through my experience, I think that especially folks who are in smaller municipalities or cities, like, it was really helpful that I found a political home, an organization that really skilled me up in organizing and, activism. And it really, really helped me be able to approach people confidently about the issues and the things that I wanted to organize around, especially when, I'm having conversations at City Hall with folks, right? I draw from that organizer inside of me, right? And I think that once you have that experience, it's not necessarily whether people, support you or, the system is hard to navigate. You have that mindset of dismantling, that system altogether. So when I'm navigating these spaces and knowing that they're not created for me, I go into it already knowing that I'm going to have to totally dismantle everything that was done, right, and create a new system that is for me, right? That means, changing hearts and minds, right? Getting folks, to work with me, right? But being very consistent and thorough. So I don't know. I think what worked for me and what made me most comfortable and allowed me to walk into my candidacy now is by being an organizer previously.
Amazing. Anyone else on how do you just try to get involved when the places may not be for you or designed for you?
I just want to briefly say that I had a Zoom call with a young trans person, a college student that I got connected with, and he's a young trans man, and he told me that his dream is to be the next Chase Strangio. So I just wanted to share that with Chase, because you are blazing trails for so many young people in the legal field, and you should just know how many people you're inspiring.
We're gonna sell Chase Strangio dolls.
Oh my God, perfect.
So, well, this is all. Yeah, one could not have engineered this even better, because Sarah, your comment takes us actually to our last question, and Chase was the last person that we started with in the first question, and now will be the way that we end by handling the last question of the night is actually directed to you, Chase. So I'm gonna read this word for word because it's personal. Chase, can you please speak up to the lack of trans masculine representation in the media and politics right now? Does this create, it's three questions, but they phrase it as one. That's the first. The second is, does this create an extra burden on you personally? And if so, what can the rest of us do to help?
It is 10:30 p.m. in the East Coast, and I will try my best.
7:24, 6 minutes.
No, I just meant like, it's late here in New York. No, but so my brain is in that mode. But can I speak to it in terms of like, can I explain it or just emotionally respond to it? I mean, I think that if we look at the way that, trans misogyny operates and sort of the hypervisibility and violence that is enacted on the bodies of women, generally inclusive of trans women and femmes, and particularly Black and brown trans women, that, there's a way in which, visibility and violence then, create sort of energy in the public sphere. And I think that when we think about what media is drawn to, that it's often, has a really violent undertone. It's sort of things that can be debated, things that can be controlled, things that are, seemingly sexualized in particular ways. And that there is a way in which I think the hypervisibility and overrepresentation, within the trans spectrum of trans women and femmes is part of that history of violence and scrutiny. And that then there's like the way in which the dominance of masculinity then can make for the invisibility of trans masculinity. And there's a way in which, because of how transphobia and anti-transness operates, there's a misogyny and the invisibility as well, because trans men are always seen as women and then, seen as being victims of our own transness. And I think that's very dominant right now in the conversation about banning healthcare for trans kids. The way in which there's a fixation on the sort of the disappearing lesbian is an incredibly misogynistic discourse that's about taking away control from trans masculine people. And so I think that's part of what's going on. In terms of is it a burden on me personally, I would say, that the burden is just that there's so much violence and anti-transness in the world, and none of us should have to contend with that. And I think that the work is all of us sort of trying to continue to challenge that, to show up. And Mariah said earlier, the organizers are showing up. That is the thing that everyone can do. People showed up in Texas and blocked those bills. People showed up in Louisiana and blocked those bills, and people are showing up and to care for each other. And so that, I think, is what we do keep doing. And this is just so incredible to see all of you all and know that there's other incredible trans folks running. Shout out to Kendall Martinez Wright, and who's running in Missouri. Shout out to other trans folks who are out there running for office, holding space, making these demands. And there are more trans mass people as well. So I think that those are my sort of less coherent reflections. I apologize, but I am just so always honored to be doing the work, and the burden just comes from the fact that we don't live in the world that we should quite yet.
Well, thank you all so much for fighting for the world that we all want to live in and that we deserve to live in, for using your visibility to be able to advance our rights politically, our voice legally. Regardless of what we think of it, the United States is a political nation. That's how it was founded. And so if we're going to have a chance of living in that country, then we need more and more people who are willing to take the risk and to assume the burdens of being visible politically and legally in every single way. And I know that everyone in our community thanks you, and we owe you our thanks, not only for what you're doing, but also for giving us 2 hours tonight. Additionally, we want to thank the Transgender District, of course, honoring the vision of Honey Mahogany, Janetta Johnson, and Aria Saeed, to honor and thank Aria for her vision as a leader, and also Jupiter Peraza for organizing us all tonight. Everyone have a wonderful and a safe Pride Month, and take everything that you've learned to heart. So appreciative of you all.
And thank you, Amara.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you guys later. Next time we're having a cookout with drinks.
Yeah.